Welcome to TP 201, Transfer Pricing for Tangibles. We're going to continue with another video about the resale price method. In this case, we're going to talk about an example where the resale price method works better than the comparable profits method. Now, one of the times, or there are several times when this might happen, it may be that your distributor has a fairly large amount of substantial fixed costs. Those costs are not moving with the business cycle. They would be falling, say, below the line of the gross profit, and in which case that could be problematic. Another category could come up with when the distributor has relatively lumpy sales, that maybe a relatively steady selling period can happen and then it suddenly gets a large amount of sales, or it goes the opposite way. It could have suddenly makes a lot less money. This could be particularly a problem for a distributor who is distributing something that's a very large item, like a supercomputer. If they sell just one, they might lose money, but if they sell two, they break even. When they sell the three in 1 year, then they might actually make a huge amount of money. We can sometimes solve that problem with averaging multiple years together, like we often do with the comparable profits method. But frankly, we may also be able to solve the problem by looking at the gross margin in those transactions, because a lot of the reason why they would be making or losing money have to go back to that first point I said. They might have substantial fixed costs. It could also be caught up to where there's substantial services that are being offered in conjunction with the sale of goods, and that those services might be being picked up in something below the cost of goods sold line. And if you see a variation in the SG&A expenses, which we often call operating expenses relative to sales, that could be one more reason that you may have a more stable and a more reliable analysis based upon gross margin than you would based upon the operating margin. So let's take a look at these various examples with this one case that sort of points a lot of these kind of problems out. I'm going to bring up a pen so we can show a few things here. All right, so let's suppose that this is our distributor, and let's focus on the first 3 years where everything is completely stable. We have sales of 100 in each of those years, COGS of 75, gross profit 25, SG&A of 20, and an operating profit of 5. So if we think about this from a resale price method, what we're going to have here is a gross margin of 25%, and that's very stable for those 3 years, so that's a good thing. And we'd have an operating margin here of 5%. And let's just assume that 5% would be nicely in the range if we had gone out and created a set of comparable independent distributors who have no controlled transactions to worry about. And as I was pointing out, I said this is very stable over all 3 years situation. Now, given this is now we're going to take a look at something a little different. We're going to say, what happens if sales are lumpy? So let me just clean the screen up a little bit. I'm going to take that off and that off and go back to a marker. Let's suppose now in year 4, sales double. Now, the important thing I want to point out next is notice that at the same time, COGS also doubled. They're 2 times what they were before. Well, that's fine. It says essentially the unit cost per item we've sold is stayed the same. We haven't changed the transfer price at all. And in which case, if we go here and we look at our gross margin, again, we're going to have 50 as the numerator because that's our gross profit over the 200. And so our gross margin continues to be 25%. Okay, so we would have thought if 25%, let's say, was reasonable, you notice down here now suddenly we have a big profit, much bigger than before. Our operating profit for this 1 year would be the 30 over the 200, right? So that's a very big operating profit, relatively speaking. Generally speaking, though, within a CPM, we'd actually be averaging multiple years together. So if we look at these 3 years together, our operating margin is then going to be, say, 40 in operating profit divided by the sales of all 3 years, so that's going to be 400. So the operating margin has jumped up to 10%. That could well be outside our range. If we had created a range of third-party firms and we're applying a CPM, a comparable profits method, to this, which could be a problem. And the interesting thing here is that it is not because the transfer price has changed at all. If we go back up and look at COGS, we can see that those are gone up. If sales doubled, COGS doubled, they charged us the same price per unit. Our gross margin didn't change. All of this swing in profitability has to do with the fact that, well, we had a very good year, sales doubled, but our SG&A remained at 20. It's very steady. So the sales guys have a good year, and suddenly it looks like we're making much too much money in the distributor, and the jurisdiction that sold to that distributor might be saying, well, we think there should be an adjustment that you should be paying us more. Now, that said, let's take a look at what happens when this thing swings in the other direction. So I'm going to clean up the board here a bit. Let's suppose we go out to year 5 now, and we're going to have a bad year relative to even our standards. So in the past, we generally sold 100. Now we're selling 50 in this year. Again, our COGS have gone down by an appropriate amount. In other words, when we sell 100, we had to pay 75 for our COGS. When we sold 50, we've got to pay 37.5, right? Exactly half of what it had been, say, in year 3. So our gross margin is still going to calculate out to the same 25%. And if that had been in the range before, it's hopefully still in the range now. That's not a problem. But notice what's happened. I'm sorry, I drew that in the wrong spot, because that should really be right down here where the gross profit is. So 37, the 12.5 is 25% of the 50. But again, our SG&A has stayed stable. It's not moving up and down. Even though we've had a bad sales year, we still have a certain amount of SG&A expense that's not changing. In fact, that expense, there isn't even enough gross profit to cover that expense. This time we have a loss. Now, when we have a loss, what are we going to do? Well, with a CPM, we're going to look at these 3 years together. And in that case, we're going to say, well, you got 35 minus 7.5, so we're down at about 27 something, divided by 350 in sales up here, because you got year 3, 4, and 5 together. And that's going to work out to an operating margin of 7.8%. So that's still, on average, may look relatively high for a distributor. And that, as an operating margin, I'm just going to label that OM so that people know what I'm talking about here. And that's going to be a real problem. And again, the fluctuations entirely because sales are going up and down, our transfer price is steady, but our SG&A is fixed. So we've got this variation in SG&A to sales ratio that tells us something about what's going on as what's driving this problem. Let me clean up the board just a little bit and then show, again, one more variation on this problem. Let's suppose that year 5 was followed by 2 years of sort of normal activity. So year 5 is going to be right here. And then I'm going to say, and then what if we had year 6 looked like year 1 and year 7 looked like year 2? So then we're going to have a total profit over those 3 years of, well, we've got 10 to the positive here, but a loss here, so we've got a total of 2.5. And we're going to have sales of 100 in year 1, well, now year 6, and 100 in year 7. But back in year 5, we have 50, so we've got 250. And the math here is pretty easy. This means we have an operating margin of 1. So if that's our operating margin, now we're in danger of going in the other direction, right? We have an operating margin of 1 that may be too low. So when someone looks at those 3 years averaged together, they'd be saying, this, we need to have an even lower COGS because we're not hitting a high enough targeted operating margin. And if that's the case, we'd say, well, wait a minute. In all of these cases, we have the exact same identical, again, I drew it in the wrong spot, 25% gross profit margin. Our transfer price is not what's causing our problem here. Our transfer price is right and unchanging at that 25% margin. It's that the cyclical effect is driving our operating margin up and down and erroneously making a tax authority think that an adjustment might be warranted. So I hope this explains something about the times when a resale price method might be a more appropriate method than, say, a comparable profits method. And it may be very helpful to keep that tool in your arsenal for being able to demonstrate that a taxpayer's transfer prices meet the arm's length standard. I hope you enjoyed this video and the others in this series. We'll be doing some more videos on the resale price method and in other topics on tangible goods. Thanks and have a great day.